Hello. As you may have gathered, I have quite a decent vocabulary, but today, or was it yesterday, I was the proud learner of a new word. It's Twixtmas, that strange period which we now are between Christmas and the New Year. And what we're going to have now is not what many people wanted me to do, a Christmas Day broadcast, and that would be a little usurping, wouldn't it? It is a Twixtmas broadcast, which is a bit of a parody, I suppose. And essentially, well, I spent a great deal of David Starkey Talks talking about how to do good history and the nature of good history. So this Twixtmas Day broadcast is about bad history and an outstanding example of really bad history, which happily was published today in the Daily Telegraph and was then picked up by the Daily Mail, which you wouldn't expect to know better, and the Times, which once upon a time you would have expected to know better. The story, well, it does have a royal connection, inevitably. It's Richard III. The story is as follows. There is in deepest rural Devon a very beautiful parish church which used to be called Coldridge and St Matthew's Coleridge and now is known as St Matthew's Coldridge. In the church there is a somewhat battered tomb of an early 16th century figure. It's datable to the third year of Henry VIII, that's 1511, 1512, of a figure apparently wearing armour, chainmail, with a gown over it, quite usual, recumbent, and bearing a shield. Actually, it's a jousting shield, which is inscribed John Evans. Well, not quite, but we'll discuss that. And the figure is looking towards a stained glass window in which there appears a very fine but fragmentary portrait of no less than one of the princes in the Tower, King Edward V. It's not labelled, but the dress, the long hair, and everything else shows clearly that that's what it is. What's all this about? Well, the figure, the image, the effigy bearing the shield, the name is oddly spelt. It appears as John Evas, mysterious missing N, you notice. Well, how do we understand that? The extraordinary intelligence of this cold case team that has been assembled by Philippa Langley, that's the woman who discovered the body of Richard III in the car park at Leicester because the body was under, I can't remember, was it parking, was it the King bit, or was it the Richard bit, or indeed the R King bit? Anyway, it was discovered under parking in the mysterious operations of Dan Brown. Well, Edward V, E-V-A-S, Asilium, Exile. What could be clearer? This chap, this mysterious chap, isn't it? Obvious. It's Edward V in exile. And what's he looking at? Well, he's looking at the image of Edward V. Well, in other words, he's looking at his own image. And to give you a clue above it, suspended, there is a somewhat fragmentary, but again, very fine version of the imperial crown, showing the crown with the fragments of its arches, and below it there is the ermine border of the crown, in which, astonishingly, there are shown deer. Now, this so-called John Evans is a parker in charge of the park at Coldridge. So deer, you get it? There are deer shown as part of the ermine. And just guess what? There are 41 deer. 41. How old would Edward V have been in 1511-12? You've got it. He's born in 1470. Born in 1470, when his father is in exile and his mother, Elizabeth of Woodville, is herself in asylum, in refuge, in the sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, because the Lancastrians and a group of renegade Yorkists under the wicked Earl of Warwick have seized the throne and put back the half-demented Henry VI on the throne. So little Edward is born in 1470, which means that this mysterious E.V. As Evans, obviously pseudonym, is telling us, here I am, I'm dying at the age of 41, but I'm at last reclaiming the crown that is mine, or at least telling you, offering us all these clues, that I've been here in exile, in refuge, living under an anonymous name on, curiously enough, the estates of my half-brother, that's to say, the Thomas Grey, the Marquis of Dorset, who is the eldest son of Elizabeth Woodville by her first marriage to Sir Richard Grey. So, what could be clearer? We now know, don't we, because it's there to be proved, that Richard III didn't murder at least the eldest Prince of the Tower, but he kindly sent him to live in a generous exile in the middle of Devon on the lands of Thomas Grey, the Marquis of Dorset. Where do you start with this? Where do you begin? Well, I think you begin with the fact that it is self-evidently mad. If it sounds like Dan Brown, well, it is mad. The thing that's even more alarming is apparently professional investigators who once were, or perhaps still are, members of the police force were involved, and they model this procedure on that of a cold case inquiry. And if you want to know, I'm afraid, why there have been so many appalling failures to solve crimes and so many crimes that have been ascribed to the wrong person and, the Birmingham this and whatever, these procedures tell you. Apparently the secret of understanding things is, if there is a coincidence, investigate. Shall we just start right at the beginning? John Evans. I don't know anything about John Evans. A quick search hasn't yielded anything, but there's a single reference which I'll come back to later. The shield. Well, the shield is interesting in that it's in the form of a jousting shield. That's a lobed shield. In other words, you put your spear through the corner of the shield. This is pointing to somebody who is probably pretty professionally involved in arms, as is, in other words, what we would now call a soldier, as is the fact that he seems to be shown, and again, the photographs of the effigy aren't good enough to tell fully, apparently wearing some form of chain mail. All of that suggests a soldier of, if it's chainmail, of pretty modest rank. Okay. What about the business of the missing N in Evans that led to this extraordinary construction that it's a kind of code, Dan Brown again, a code name, E.V. Edward V A.S. in Asylum? Well, actually, if you look carefully, the N isn't missing at all. Instead, it's shown in the usual fashion with a little bar above it. The handwriting of the late Middle Ages, this is before you've really got going with printing, uses a form of shorthand. You use abbreviation, particularly in Latin forms, and the standard way that you abbreviate for the letter N is just to show a narrow bar above the line of lettering. So in fact it's not this mysterious EVAS, it is EVN assumed by the bar S. So we've eliminated one point. Let's now have a look at this mysterious crown with its alleged 41 deer. Oh dear, well, let's just scroll down here and find it. And there we are, by the way, there's the shield. And then here we've got the crown above the figure. Very fine, it's very, very high quality stained glass. The crown suspended above the head of the already crowned Edward V. Oh dear. If you look rather carefully, you'll see the mysterious fact that lots of these deer have at least 5 legs. They're not deer. They're what's called the labels, the black tails on the ermine. And that's the standard way of representing them heraldically. And it's actually rather fine. What we think of as a crown is actually two completely separate bits. There is the band of the crown, the gold band with, as is correctly shown here, with the English crown, alternating fleur-de-lis and cross-pâté. The fleur-de-lis are put there by Henry V or perhaps Henry VI to symbolise the claim to France. The cross-pâté represents England. And so that's the metal frame of the crown, of course, heavily jewelled and studied with great ballast rubies and sapphires and some diamonds and pearls and so on. And then above it, the cross arches that represent the imperial claim, the English throne, again shown very clearly here. But you put the crown on over a hat, what is usually referred to as the cap of maintenance. And this is a velvet cap. If you look at the modern crown, you can see the rumpled velvet, purple, usually purple or scarlet velvet inside it. And then there's a narrow border of ermine that goes round the bottom, because originally, as is shown very clearly here, the cap was ermine lined. So it's actually a cap you put on, because the crown itself is very uncomfortable. You don't want a rough metal object sitting on your head. So there's the cap and the crown. And as I said, what are supposedly the 41 deer representing Evans's supposed office, actual office of Parker, and the number of years of his age since he'd been born in 1470 is, I'm afraid, an absolute load of tosh. It is simply a representation of the crown. Let's go down and look still further. There is another image of a figure that's got longish hair and apparently and wearing some ermine. The construction of the mysterious experts, those who want to turn this into a Dan Brown story, a Dan Brown legend, is that this represents John Evans in his 40s on the points of death, actually carrying the crown and wearing ermine as a symbol of the fact that he had been rightful king. Actually, if you look at this image more carefully, you'll see it's not carrying a crown at all. It's wearing what's called a livery collar. And the livery collar consists, as far as you can see, of two elements. It consists of the Yorkist white rose and it consists of the fleur-de-lis. Probably, in other words, the figure represents a Yorkist ancestor of Edward V, probably his grandfather Richard, Duke of York, since it's not shown crowned, but is shown with the ermine of a royal prince and a livery collar that indicates its membership of the House of York. Are we getting the idea? Let's just investigate a little bit further. What is it likely to be if the idea that this is a symbol of as it were, a royal prince sent to live in exile and in his dying year daring to give clues to posterity so that Philippa Langley can come along and claim that Richard III didn't really murder the princes in the Tower. Obviously that's silly. What is it instead? Well, I think it's really pretty simple. These are now guesses on my part, but they're guesses framed within actual historical knowledge, not the fictions purveyed by the Richard III Society or Philippa Langley, or indeed, I fear, the Metropolitan Police. Certainly, this is what's called a chantry chapel. This is somebody, the John Evans here, in the image, who will have left money to maintain a priest to sing masses for his soul in the little church here. Well, not so little church, actually. It's a very, very fine church. There's wonderful 15th century woodwork in it as well, in the 15th century church of Coldridge. So it's a chantry chapel. But why then the images of Edward V? Why the crown? Why perhaps Richard, Duke of York? Why the many other Yorkist symbols that adorn the church? There are suns in splendour, white roses and so on. Why all of these things? Is it something very extraordinary? The answer is it's not in the least extraordinary at all, because what you tended to do if you'd been a royal servant, or indeed the servant of any great man, you not only arrange for the chantry chapel to pray for your soul and the souls of members of your family and your children, you will also set it up to pray for the souls of your benefactor and the members of his or her family. This is very regular proceedings. In fact, there's a very similar example to this in, of all places, Windsor, where there is a chantry chapel of a man called Oliver King, who had been secretary, royal secretary, to Edward IV, that's the father of Edward V, to Edward V himself, and to Henry VII. Notice conspicuous, he hadn't been secretary to Richard III, and his chantry at Windsor commemorates those three kings and sets up funds to pray for them, as well as for himself. So clearly, certainly, what this arrangement tells us is that John Evans had actually been a servant of Edward V, maybe even a servant of Edward IV, but he'd certainly been a servant of Edward V when he was Prince of Wales. I've talked extensively in the light of the upbringing of Henry VIII and of Prince Arthur about the upbringing of this prince, these two Yorkist princes, the Yorkist Prince of Wales, that's the boy who briefly becomes Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And I pointed out how the elder of them, that's this Edward, is sent off to Ludlow with a major household to be brought up and trained in the arts of kingship by ruling from virtually childhood as Prince of Wales, and invested with various substantial powers exercised by a council. In other words, being trained on the job. And I would guess, though I can't prove it yet, I imagine the evidence will come up, that this John Evans would have been a member of that household. And the fact that all of this is associated with the estates of the Marquis of Dorset, in very high favour because of the Woodville connection, and that other members of the Grey family are very prominent within the household of the Prince of Wales, between the household of Edward, Prince of Wales, underscores that fact. In other words, John Evans isn't a missing Yorkist prince, he is the servant of the dead, the killed, the murdered, Edward V, murdered 99% certainly by Richard III. How can I be so confident about saying that? Because contemporaries were, people right outside England. The best contemporary account of the reign of Richard, at least the usurpation of Richard III, is that by Domenico Mancini, and that is written at the very end of 1483. Literally, it's a blow-by-blow account. It's written in the months of Richard's actual usurpation. It's presented in France the following January, and it is explicit in explicit is the wrong word. There is a powerfully implied charge of murder, and the charge becomes explicit at the French Estates General, which are held in the January of 1484, when the French Chancellor directly accuses Richard of murdering his nephews. Fine. So, we've got then Evans having been a servant of Edward when he was Prince of Wales, and presumably therefore a servant of him in those brief months, when he's brief weeks actually, when he's king. What happens to him? Well, the man that he seems to be associated with, Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset, flees into exile after the usurpation of Richard, and where does he flee to? He flees to Brittany. And whom does he join in Brittany? He joins Henry Tudor, who is in exile in Brittany, the future Henry VII. I would guess it is 99% certain that John Evans joins Thomas Grey in exile, maybe even attaching himself to Grey, maybe having been associated with him and the Grey family in the household of of Edward, Prince of Wales, and briefly Edward V, he joins the group of exiles in Brittany. And what happens to him next? Well, we don't know, but there's quite a lot of evidence about them, and a bit more combing may actually bring his name to light. We know that Thomas Grey there's powerful pressure applied to him to return to England, to actually make his peace with Richard, and he actually breaks away from the exiles and is recaptured and brought back in humiliating fashion to Henry Tudor, and thereafter a very fraught relationship indeed with Henry VII. So perhaps, this word that really should have been there, perhaps, probably, when finally Henry VII usurps again, because of course he is a usurper too, but he's a victorious usurper. He defeats the other usurper, Richard III, in battle, and he becomes king, and Grey comes back, and presumably Evans comes back. And what happens to them, we simply do not know. What happens to Evans, we simply do not know. We know of the tense relations between Dorset and Henry VII, which finally culminate in Dorset's arrest, exile, and being held in Calais under threat of execution till very nearly the last months of the reign. And then something very interesting happens. Grey comes back at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign to a right royal welcome, as do other people with very powerful Yorkist connections, like the lad who is Earl of Devon, and his son who will become Marquis of Exeter. They descend from Catherine Plantagenet, who had married the Courtenay's Earl of Devon, and they again, Devon had been exiled, and they're brought back, and they're in very high favour. Because what we forget, and we now need to remember, is at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, and this is where this very early date, this date of the third year of Henry VIII, becomes really fascinating. The beginning of Henry VIII's reign sees a marked Yorkist revival. Can I spell those words out again? A marked Yorkist revival. We think of Henry VIII because of what he did in the 1530s, what he will do to those lines of the Courtenays and so on, to the other line that descends from the Duke of Clarence, that descends from Margaret Plantagenet, the Countess of Salisbury, Richard Pole, and so on. What he does to all of those, the terrible slaughter that he wreaks on those, we tend to think of him as like his father, the profound enemy of the House of York. He's only the enemy of the House of York in the 1530s because so many of those people, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury, Reginald Pole, the Cardinal, Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, they all take the wrong side in the Reformation. They are killed not as members of the House of York, they're executed. Not as members of the House of York, they're executed because they are Catholicizing, because in various ways they are rejecting the royal supremacy and the divorce, which are the central features of Henry VIII's policy at this period. None of this applies in the first few years of Henry's reign. The first few years of Henry's reign see something completely different. Remember, Henry himself is half Yorkist. His mother is the elder sister of Edward V. She is Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, and his wife Elizabeth Woodville. She, right through Henry VII's reign, continues to flaunt the white rose in just the same way that her husband uses the red rose, the rose that he actually invents or has invented for him as the symbol of the House of Lancaster at the Battle of Bosworth, and the Beaufort portcullis. What neither of them use is the Tudor rose, the combined red and white rose. Each one identifies instead with one of those two great warring families. The first person regularly to use the Tudor rose is Henry VIII, because he equally descends from Lancaster through his father, pseudo-Lancaster through his father, Beaufort through his father, and genuinely, fully from York through his mother. And what Henry does at the beginning of his reign is consciously to reintegrate the surviving members of the House of York into the English aristocracy. And he does it for a simple and straightforward reason. He wants, and indeed I think his father, in fact I know his father, had as it were, imprinted this idea in his mind and given him the means to do it. Henry aims to renew the 100 Years' War with France as quickly as possible, and to do that you have to bring about a dynastic settlement in England, which is what he triumphantly does at the beginning of his reign. So what I think we need to do, rather than having all this silly speculation about Evans as being the missing Edward V, we need to see it instead as a moment in which you could fully come out of the woodwork as a committed supporter of the House of York, now of course fully loyal to Henry VIII, because Henry is the direct lineal descendant of that house. And we can see, I think, here Evans advertising proudly his former loyalty to his old master, Edward V, but also to his new master, Henry VIII, whose name also appears in the ornamentation and inscriptions around the tomb and the prayer desk that seem to form part of the general bequest, the chantry bequest of John Evans. So we've got here then, and in the background, clearly, there will also be the involvement of Thomas Grey, the Marquis of Dorset, again restored to high favour, to a major place at court, to an important role in the council, and so on, which he continues to enjoy. So here we have not Dan Brown clues to a dead Yorkist prince, or rather, in fact, to a Yorkist prince who's been underground and reveals himself only at the moment of death. We've got something much more interesting. We've got a monument to that change in the dynastic atmosphere of early Tudor England, and that change which briefly for 15 odd years, brings the House of York and those associated with it fully back into the favour of the Tudor court, into the favour of Henry VIII. You get this happy dynastic union of York and Lancaster, only to be ripped apart by the tensions of the Reformation 15, 20 years on, in the 20 years on, let's get the date right, 20 years on in the 1530s. That's the good history. What do we need to pin this down? Well, we need to identify or come up with a plausible guess as to who and what John Evans was. I would take a pretty strong guess that he is a yeoman of the crown. There is, we know, such a yeoman who receives 6pence a day, which is a decent pension, in the 1510s, in the teens of the 16th century. The Yeoman of the Crown is the as it were, the official title of the people that we know as the Yeoman of the Guard. And these are the ones who are actually being given a formal established position within the royal household with the higher title of Yeoman of the Crown. In other words, they're the equivalent of Chelsea pensioners. They are people who would have been active within the Guard, will have distinguished themselves within the Guard, and then will have been pensioned off. And in the case of John Evans, goes to live in retirement in Coldridge, because this would then account for everything. It accounts for the quality of the stained glass. This is very high quality stuff. In other words, and also it's accurate. This suggests good court contacts. Well, of course, he had good court contacts as an ex-yeoman of the Guard, as of course did the Marquis of Dorset as a leading member of the royal court, of the council, and later on actually of the Privy Chamber. So if we think of him in this position, we have the explanation. What we now need, of course, is the proper documentation. Maybe it will come up, maybe it won't. But at least, looking at it properly, exploring it in the context of the actual knowledge of the period, as opposed to fantasy, to myth, to Dan Brown, to the extraordinary playing around with imaginative coincidence, and above all, setting aside the desire to exonerate Richard III, looking at the history as it is, as it was, as the evidence suggests. It's got a bit serious, really, for a Twixtmas celebration, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.